All right, this week I am borrowing words from Debbie Thomas, in part because she says this so well, and in part because I was trying really hard this week not to work way over time. And also, in part because on Friday night I was up with the dog like most of the night because she was sick. So, you're getting the words from Debbie Thomas about this passage. But I think she says it really well. So, the tomb is empty. Christ is risen. Death has been defeated. Love wins. We're a resurrection people. The victory is ours, and nothing on earth will ever be the same again, right? Right? Yeah. Welcome to the week after Euphoria. The week after Triumph, the week after the Easter lilies, the egg hunts, the brunches, the trumpets, the vigils, the baptisms, and the alleluias, right? The week after in the room feels really different. This is the point in the liturgical year when we take a good, hard look at God's post-resurrection world and think, now what? Or, if we're painfully, brutally honest, we might think, so what? I don't know about you, so this is again Debbie Thomas. I don't know about you, but I am beyond grateful for the gospel reading from John this week because it reminds us that the resurrection story honors these questions. Our glorious Easter hymns notwithstanding, the week after has always been murky, messy, and complicated. I'm not the first human being to struggle with it, and I won't be the last. In fact, the struggle seems to be intrinsic to the post-Easter story. So, here are two ways that the gospel reading this week reflects what real life looks like after the empty tomb. One is wounds, because Jesus appears to his disciples in a body that is resurrected and still wounded. And the second way is doubts, because Thomas enters into a community of faith and openly voices his doubts. So let's talk about those. First one is wounds. Jesus appears to his disciples in a body that is resurrected and still wounded. Christians tend to put a lot of stock in victory. We value the race won, the mountain scaled, the enemy defeated, the obstacle overcome. We like to hear stories of failure to an extent because we really like to hear them only when the stories are shared in retrospect, long after the sordid worst is over. Sin that has surrendered to holiness, that's a Christian story that we like to hear. But sin that clings, or challenges that won't ease up, a wound, whether physical, psychological, or relational, that wound that still remains, we squirm. We turn our eyes away. We worry. And still, Jesus' wounded body reminds us that some hurts are for keeps. Some markers of pain, loss, trauma, and horror leave traces that no amount of piety will take away. So I'm participating in a cohort that's called the Trans-Affirming Churches Cohort. So I'm learning about how do we make sure we're paying attention to being affirming and to actually create a trans-flourishing space, right? So being attentive to that. And in the group last week, someone who is trans shared that they really appreciate that Jesus' wounded body shows up in this story because it's a connection point for them as a transgender person. Because that person's wounds and scars will never go away, and Jesus shows us that his wounds and scars are a part of him too. Some wounds remain, even after resurrection. Debbie Thomas continues and says, the fact is, change and growth occur slowly. We rarely, if ever, experience instant transformation. The changes that matter most have always come sideways and in fits and starts, often without our conscious understanding or effort. So for anyone who has battled addiction or stuck it out in a challenging relationship or lived with a chronic illness, will testify that genuine conversion is lifelong. Maybe this is why the earliest Christians referred to their new faith as the way. A way is not a destination. It is a road to walk. It is an invitation to a journey. So Jesus' resurrected body retained its scars. And they aren't old scars. They're not neat and faded scars signaling a long ago victory on a half-forgotten battlefield. These are fresh wounds, still raw enough to allow a doubting disciple to place his fingers inside. I imagine Jesus winced when Thomas touched him. But that wincing, that pain, that openness signals real life, real engagement, real presence. It speaks the very words that Thomas hungered for the most. I am here. I am here with you. I don't float a few sanitized feet above reality. This is Jesus, right? I don't float up here, even after death. Instead, I dwell in the hot, searing heart of things, exactly where you dwell. We all live in a culture that worships artifice. And so all around us, people package themselves. They market themselves. They pummel themselves into versions of perfection that choke their souls. But if Jesus, even at the apex of resurrection victory, sported his open wounds without shame or apology, then maybe we don't need to worry so much about our glossy presentation. Maybe Christianity's best appeal is in its willingness to embrace real bodies, real scars, real pain. After all, it is with our bodies that we experience deep trauma, deep anger, deep terror, and deep joy. It is in our chests that hurts when we mourn. It is in our throats that ache when we are beyond sad. It is our faces that burn when we are angry, and our whole bodies warm with pleasure when we are happy. In his resurrection, Jesus honored the body. Jesus honored our bruised, broken, wounded, or disabled bodies. Jesus honored our real life bodies, those in which we live. So our wounds are not pretty, and they do not tell the whole story of who we are, but the stories they tell are holy. And if Jesus himself did not fear the bloody and the broken, then perhaps those of us who are walking in his footsteps don't need to fear them so much either. So again, the first way that this story helps us see what real life looks like after the tomb is in those wounds. And then the second way is in doubts. Because Thomas enters into a community of faith and openly voices his doubts. And let's face it, Thomas often gets a bad rap in the church. We always read about Thomas's encounter with the resurrected Jesus on the Sunday after Easter, and often we cast Thomas in negative terms. He's most famously known as Doubting Thomas, sometimes called a cynic or a holdout. His reluctance to accept the testimony of his fellow disciples, insistence on the physical proof, his late arrival to the joyful belief of his peers, these are often described as spiritual flaws in Thomas. signs of stubbornness or perhaps a weak faith. But is this weakness? Is a question we can ask. Perhaps instead of seeing a weak person, we see a man who is yearning for a living encounter with Jesus. Or we see a person who won't settle for someone else's experience of resurrection, but sticks around in hope of having their own personal experience. Perhaps you see Thomas as someone who dared to confess uncertainty in the midst of those who were certain. That's a risky thing to do. Or a man who recognized in Jesus, a man who recognized Jesus as Lord in Jesus' woundedness, not in his glory. So according to John's gospel, Thomas had to wait a whole week. He had to wait in suspense and uncertainty for that whole week after his friends first said they'd seen Jesus. I think that would be an uncomfortable week. Do you suppose Thomas pitied his fellow disciples for their grief-stricken delusions? Or did he fear? And this again is Debbie Thomas, but it's also me, right? Did Thomas fear, as I often do, that he'd missed the memo, or missed the boat, or missed the glory? That he was destined only to ever know God's second hand? What might strike us most about Thomas's story is not that he doubted, but that he did so publicly, without shame or guilt, and that his faith community allowed him to do that. And what we can notice about Jesus' response is that he met Thomas right where he was, freely offering the disciple the testimony of his own wounds and his own pain. After such an encounter, we can only imagine the tenderness and urgency with which Thomas was able to repeat Christ's words to other doubters. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Because isn't this all of us on the Sunday after Easter? Don't we wrestle with hidden doubts and hidden fears? Don't we wonder sometimes if the miracle of resurrection will hold in ordinary time? If nothing else, Thomas reassures us that faith doesn't have to be straightforward. The business of accepting resurrection and of living it out, of sharing it with the world, it's tough. And it is okay to waver. It is okay to take our time. And it is okay to hope for more. Wounds and doubts, these surface in this story. And the encounter between them is what life looks like after the tomb. When Thomas's doubts meet Jesus' wounds, new life erupted, faith blossomed, and the community grows. Resurrection happens all over again. So during this week after, or this next week after, may this be the same for all of us. Amen.